In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. There once was a congregation. It was located in a rural area. And it was a poor congregation. It wasn't very large, but it didn't have very much money to do its work. It's not that the members of the congregation were poor. No, they were people of modest means. They weren't rich. They were stingy. They weren't going to give the church any more than the church absolutely needed. And they were very careful about that, reviewing the budget, trying to figure out what the church really needed to function, the pastor's salary, the utilities, some minor repairs, the day-to-day kind of maintenance. But there was never any money for any major projects. And even though those needs were mentioned, the stingy congregation never really was persuaded to change its ways. The biggest concern, and that this may ring true with some of you in this room, is the heating system, the boiler. It was old and worn out, and that's nice. I like hearing that. How are you? Good. Glad you're here. Well, the boiler was worn out, and every year in the fall, the vestry would have a discussion. Winter's coming, cold weather's coming. What if the boiler quits in the middle of the winter? What will we do? Well, maybe this fall is the time to replace the boiler, someone said. Discussion ensued about whether they should take that risk of replacing the boiler. And finally someone said, but do we have the money? And they all looked at the treasurer, who shook his head. And so it was decided that they'd pray and they'd hope that the boiler would make it through the winter one more time. It didn't. Right, the coldest week of the year, the boiler quit. And word spread through the congregation very quickly, and people were prepared when they came to church the next Sunday with really heavy coats bundled up, long underwear for some of them. And they kind of huddled in the pews, sitting next to each other to try to share body heat among themselves. The pastor got up to preach. He said, you all know that the boiler died. There is no hope of resurrection. I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that we have the money to replace the heating system. And we may have enough to do some other things as well. And the congregation erupted with cheers. Yippee! Hallelujah! Wow! And when the noise died down, and the bad news, the pastor said, the bad news is that money is still in your bank accounts. And then the pastor went on to encourage, plead with the people in the congregation to move that money from their bank accounts to the church's bank accounts so the boiler could be replaced. He used the same kind of fundraising pitches that you've undoubtedly heard in your life. Do your part. Chip in. Give your fair share. Don't be left behind. If we don't do this, we won't be able to function, and we won't be able to have services. A combination of guilt and fear. The reading from the Hebrew Scriptures today, from the book of the prophet Haggai, contains a similar situation. The people are in Jerusalem, and they are at the site of the temple that Solomon built. But the Babylonians, in the year 586 BC, it's almost 600 years roundabout before Jesus, the Babylonians conquered Palestine, and they destroyed the temple that David had promised would be built to provide a house for God in Jerusalem. His son, Solomon, actually is the one who built the temple, along with other buildings in Jerusalem. Babylonians destroyed the temple, other structures as well, as a way of letting the populace know that the Babylonians were now in charge and things would be done their way. They also took the leaders, the political and the religious leaders, put them in exile in Babylon. And they were there about 60 years. Finally, circumstances were such, very complicated history. The children and the grandchildren of the exiles were able to, shall we say, return. They'd never been there before. Were able to come back to Jerusalem, back to Palestine. All the original exiles had died. Given life expectancy, 60 years, not many people would make it. It would have been possible. There wouldn't be many of the original exiles coming back to Jerusalem. It would be their children and their grandchildren who never saw the temple that Solomon built. Yet God sends Haggai on a mission and tells Haggai what to say. He's to ask the people if they remember the temple. And does the present situation compare to the temple? Now, they were standing by a pile of rubble. You and I know, around this city, there's an office building, and all of a sudden, it's destroyed. So another one can be built in its place. And we've seen that pile of rubble. It's a mess. It's not attractive. I guess it's a sign of progress with that office building, but it's kind of sad. So here they were on the site of Solomon's temple. And Haggai is to ask the people, how many of you remember this? Does this look like what it was before? And of course, we don't know when Haggai actually delivered this speech what the response was, whether anyone spoke up and said, yeah, I saw it. But what Haggai is trying to do is the same thing as the preacher in the congregation with the boiler problem. And that is encourage the people to work and give to rebuild the temple, to build the second temple, Solomon's being the first. And what he promises, what he predicts, is that the second temple will be better than the first. It will include the riches of many nations. There will be gold and silver. The splendor of the second temple will be greater than the splendor of Solomon's temple. Saying this, again, to encourage the people to support the project. Well, Haggai and others were successful, and construction of the second temple began. We think it was around the year 520 BC. And you might think that building a temple would take some time, a couple of years. 500 years later, it still wasn't finished. Jesus, we know from the gospel, visited the temple and noted that it was still under construction. But that second temple was also destroyed in the year 70 AD, about 40 years after Jesus. The Romans put down a rebellion by the Jews in Palestine and destroyed that second temple. All that's left is what is called the Wailing Wall. That is a very precious site for Jews around the world. When I looked at this reading from Scripture this week, preparing for this sermon, I thought that the same question might be asked of this congregation. Who remembers the glory days of St. Luke's Church? Few. I'm talking about the period between 1940, the mid-1940s, and the mid-1980s. This congregation was a powerhouse. A powerhouse in the neighborhood, in the city of Washington, and in the Diocese of Washington. This congregation got things done. One of its projects was to change the hiring practices of some of the stores in town, especially the department stores, who discriminated against African Americans in their hiring policies. I'm sure St. Luke's wasn't the only agent involved in this effort. There were probably others, but it was successful. And St. Luke's obtained a reputation for social justice, for civil rights. St. Luke's would go before the city council to make points on different pieces of policy that the council was considering. St. Luke's was a center here for the neighborhood to gather and to receive services. But St. Luke's itself was growing spiritually and numerically during this time. This parish house was built. Parking lot purchased. St. Luke's acquired buses that went around on Sunday morning to pick up people, to bring them here to church and to Sunday school. People looked to St. Luke's Church to get to know Jesus and to be Jesus' followers, disciples. Those are the glory days of this congregation. And I believe that the reason for that was that during that 40-year period, St. Luke's was focused outward. It was not focused on itself, but on others outside the congregation. And the examples I gave you show that. These examples show that the congregation was trying to change working conditions, trying to evangelize, bring new people to Jesus, and provide services of all kinds. In the late 1980s, St. Luke's started to lose that outward focus and became more focused on itself and its members and what they needed. And, not surprisingly, that began a period of decline. I asked, how many people remember the glory days? Well, some of you have been telling me those stories, which is what I'm speaking about. You've told me about those glory days. And they're never going to come back. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we can wave a magic wand and the 50s and 60s and 70s are going to suddenly be here. They're not. I mean, just think. We've got email. They didn't have email back then. So, you can't turn the clock back. And that was not what Haggai was saying either. He wasn't talking about, let's go back in time to Solomon. No, he was saying, we need a temple to go forward We want God to dwell in his house in Jerusalem, to be with us. Now, never mind the theology of that. I don't agree with it, but God doesn't need a house. God is spirit. God is everywhere. But at the time, this was the understanding of Judaism, that God needed a place to dwell. And it was a good thing, you're right. Good. What motivated that outward focus? That focus on other people and what they needed? One word: love. Love motivates to reach out to other people, to make their needs as important or more important as our own needs. Look at Jesus. Consider, if you will, in your mind, all the stories in the gospel about Jesus. With one exception, everything he did was focused on other people. The exception was prayer. And even that may have been outward focus. But Jesus would often go off by himself, as mentioned many times in the gospel, to pray. Pray for courage, to pray for insight, to pray for inspiration. He started his ministry by going into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights to pray. Everything else he did was focused on other people. His preaching, teaching, and healing was all focused on other people, not himself. People, he started out with a small group of people. The Gospels say it was 12, it may have been 8, it may have been 15. But there was a core group. And Jesus' first task was to, you might say, train them in the way of love. And then that small group started growing. And more, Jesus was talking about the way of love. He was also telling them, and like the Sermon on the Mount, what it means to be fully human, as God created us to be. And the more Jesus was with people, focused on other people, the more people said, if God is love, this man, Jesus, is like God. Because the love of God is embodied in this human being. We know God because we have met Jesus. We know what God's love is like because we've seen it when Jesus healed people, when he reached out to the needy, to the people on the margins of society, breaking the Jewish law to heal people. The more Jesus preached, taught, healed, the more people followed him. See, that's what we are to do. We're Christians. We are the followers of Jesus, which means we show forth the love of God, just as Jesus did in our lives. That automatically creates an outward focus. Because if we're going to be like Jesus, who was outward focused, then we need to be outward focused. The people out there, the people who live in that apartment house across the street, they have needs that we can address. Some of them are looking for a spiritual home. Some of them want to know Jesus and be a follower of Jesus, his disciple. This is an ideal place for that to happen. There are issues in this city that are desperately needing attention. The two that come to mind most are education and housing. People who are working in this city can't afford to live in this city. The housing market is aimed at the rich, not the middle class, not the poor. The education system is not serving the majority of people in the city, and most people who have means, when their kids get to be 5 years old, they move to the suburbs. That doesn't have to be. And that situation can be changed by St. Luke's Church working with other people to bring about a change for greater social equity. There are all kinds of things that St. Luke's can do with an outward focus. I mean, we might even be able to do something about our current leadership in Washington. That needs attention badly. Well, I'm going to be like the Baptist preacher, I'm sorry, not the Baptist preacher, the preacher with the boil problem. I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that we have the love to make Jesus present in this place through this congregation. The bad news is that love is locked up in our hearts. So what we need to decide to do is to open our hearts so that that love flows out. And when that happens, that's a game changer. All kinds of things can happen as a result. You know, when I drive here, I come up 15th Street on Sundays during the week. And about a block or so away, I can see the church building. The stone arch, not an arch, but the peak. And then my mind starts having a vision of the future, not the present. I know what the present problems are. This building is crumbling. Got mold. Lots of systems need to be upgraded and replaced. I know about that. And that's another matter. But what I see in my vision is a building on this parking lot. A multi-story building. An underground parking garage. Retail shops, storefronts on the first floor. Maybe a Starbucks, maybe a small grocery store, a CVS, something like that. But also a place where people can just gather, bring their lunches, and share their spiritual lives with one another. And perhaps the rector can drop in at a scheduled time and lead discussions. Kind of an open door. I know there'll be security concerns, but we can work that out. But the important thing, the building on that parking lot, the upper stories are apartments. 2, 3 bedroom apartments for low-income people. Now, St. Luke's is going to have to partner with a developer to do that. Going to have to explore how it can work with government subsidies for housing. I don't know how it's going to happen, and housing may not be it. There may be something else. But that parking lot could be used to meet the needs of people in this community. I mentioned housing before. It's for the rich. Let's do something for the poor and the middle class. A lot can happen if St. Luke's regains its outward focus, and if it becomes a church for others, not a church for us. You know, we all say it all the time, St. Luke's is my church. Or if we're talking with other members of St. Luke's, St. Luke's is our church. But what I'd like to hear is St. Luke's is their church, meaning the people outside those doors. When we start thinking about a congregation existing for other people, not its members, but for other people, then we'll be walking the way of love that Jesus talked to his disciples about 2 millennia ago. But it requires us to unlock our hearts so that that love is free to go out from us. Sure, we like to keep it for ourselves and for those who we know and are closest to us. We need to do what Jesus did and just give it away. And when we do that, we'll be a church for others. Amen.